Hi there, and welcome to Considering Comic Books. You'll have to excuse me first off. I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm going to be sounding quite bunged up this episode. I've got a very special guest on this week. Really can't believe my luck in getting him because I've only recently come across his work, but so far it's had a massive impact on my reading. I just can't get enough of it. He's worked on numerous franchises from Judge Dredd, Alpha Flight, Doctor Who, RoboCop, Terminator, and he's got a To the Death Forged by Fire series coming out in print very soon from our friends Comic Scene UK. But what he's best known for, and what most of his fans know him for, is his work on the Transformers franchise, most notably the Marvel UK stuff, but then later on in relaunching the IDW Transformers line imprint. And quite frankly, I read it recently and it blew my mind. I couldn't believe how good it was. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce everybody who fans and new fans alike to Simon Furman. Simon, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Great to chat with you.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. Well, listen, I'm quite a novice to the Transformers universe. I've only really got into it in the past few years, but from what I understand, you are one of the big architects. You're one of the major voices, and you're somebody that I know guys like major fans, like guys like Chris McFeely, a few other major collectors I know, and they all speak with reverence and deference to your run on the franchise. Well, tell us a bit about that. Tell us a bit about your time on Transformers. Give us a bit of a rundown.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it all kind of kicked off in the 80s, not much after Transformers itself kicked off. And, I was just a jobbing scriptwriter looking for work.
Sure.
And Marvel UK was doing their own Transformers stories to sort of fill the gaps between the American material. Bob Budiansky and the American comic was running. The British was doing a reprint of that. But because they were fortnightly and then weekly versus the American monthly, they needed more material than Marvel US could supply. So they brought in other writers. Steve Parkhouse did the first story. And then, I was just handed a bunch of toys, some of the overviews of the American series and the limited series they printed so far, and just told to go away and come up with some story ideas. And I'd never heard of Transformers at this point. I was kind of too old to be watching it on the TV, really, or playing with the toys.
Sure.
So it was just kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, I don't mind, I'm happy to do that. And really, it just rolled from there, and, we had no conception that, 30-something years later, we'd still be talking about it. I'd still be working on the franchise. I'd be, reprinting the stories I wrote back then in a sort of, big series of graphic novels called the Definitive G1 Collection. That's coming out at the moment.
Yep.
So, it's just sort of rolled from there. And, I wrote a lot for Marvel UK, then took over on the Marvel US comic after Bob Budiansky sort of passed the baton to me. And then, on and off since then, I've worked on pretty much every incarnation of it, from Generation 2 to Beast Wars to the IDW reinvention, the Dreamwave reinvention. So, over the years, I've worked for, most publishers on kind of most iterations of it, lots and lots of stories.
Well, what really interests me about the Transformers franchise, because I'm just coming in I'd obviously watched the cartoons, and what happened was I came across some of the later work, and I realized that it was very sophisticated. So I was told to go and read Infiltration, Escalation, and Devastation, and Stormbringer, which was your introduction to the IDW reboot, which I did, and was subsequently overwhelmed by how adult and sophisticated it was. So, well, I guess my question is, what is it about that franchise that, people find so compelling? What is it that caught kids when they were younger, but brought them back again, whenever they were older to re-immerse themselves in this, wonderful mythology, I guess?
I mean, I think they just came up with some really iconic characters to start off with, and whereas the cartoon series was maybe pitched reasonably young, they were still building on the same core concepts. So, I think there was a lot of great stuff there from the beginning, but the comics maybe just took it, with a slightly, even the Marvel US comic, they were aiming it more at comic readers than kids, really.
Yeah,
they
sure.
wanted it on a level with a lot of their other titles. They weren't trying to do a kind of junior comic, really. So, and with the UK comic, we just came at it from even a slightly more UK comics background. We came out of, 2000 AD and Battle and all these other comics. And they were always kind of quite visceral and full on for kids' comics. And I think we tackled Transformers even back in the day, with a total disregard for the fact that our audience was made up of 7, 8 or 9-year-olds, or maybe even younger.
Yeah.
So, I think we just came at it with a level of maturity that appealed to kids. They felt treated like adults, even if they didn't understand every twist and turn of the story or, every word we used. They kind of felt we weren't talking down to them in the stories. They were proper, mature science fiction action stories, albeit, about giant robots who turned into cars and trucks.
Sorry, mate. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying. So I think fundamentally it was just that. Even then, we just layered in lots of stuff that hopefully sustained the interest of the kids as they grew up into young adults and then even adults. So I think that's kind of a lot to do with its longevity.
Yeah. But, absolutely. One of the things you mentioned there was that you didn't pander at all to your audience, which is something that I've found instrumental in my own reading. It doesn't really matter to me what age the characters are, what their backgrounds are, whatever. I find that if you treat the subject matter and the characters with a level of nuance and gravity, it automatically, it's like one of my favorite TV shows, I guess, is The Wire. And what differentiated it from any other cop TV program for me was that they didn't pander to the audience, and they refused to break down street lingo and make it accessible. It was almost deliberately obfuscate and at times difficult to access because it drew you in more. And I found that about Transformers. I found that there was a lot was alluded to, but it didn't just, usually you would have a lot of sort of subtext and stuff like that inserted. And with Transformers, a lot of the time you had to find your way through the mythology, so it didn't treat you it was spoon feeding you the material. So it's very interesting to hear you say that, because that's what drew me to it straight away. That it had started as a child's toy line from Takara that had been picked up by Hasbro and turned into a TV show, but the UK writers particularly, and that's something I want to come back to, and that is that there seems to be a level of pragmatism in UK writing that wasn't necessarily in the US. Deconstructionist ideas were being applied to very simple themes, I guess. So okay. Well, what was it in particular? What is it that you think drew you? Well, beyond being a jobbing writer, what interests you about those characters, and what do you think makes you specifically suited to writing about them?
Yeah, I mean, when I started writing Transformers, I was a very sort of young and up-and-coming writer, and I didn't have many credits under my belt at that point. I'd written for a UK horror comic for kids called Scream.
Okay,
and
yeah,
that was
sure.
about it. So Transformers was really my sort of breakout job. And, I was coming from a background not just of British comics, but, I loved the Marvel comics. I grew up reading Stan Lee's Fantastic Four and Spider-Man, and, I loved that they threw in these massive kind of universe-shaking concepts into, what was effectively a comic for kids, and there was just this breadth to it, and I guess that's where I approached it from. I just wanted to make it more than just, a lot of the American stories, and this is no critique at all on the Marvel America stories, but they were largely set on Earth. They largely revolved around the robots and the human cast, and it felt quite sort of just too sort of grounded and Earth-centric. So the first thing I did, and we were aided a lot by the animated Transformers movie that came out, which had this sort of future cast that the American comic weren't going near. And suddenly we had this sort of being called Unicron, who sort of felt a little to me like a Galactus or something like that. It felt like a big mythic concept. And suddenly we just started pushing it out into time-jumping stories, gods and monsters, and, we really just kind of pushed the mythological and the breadth of what this kind of concept could be, and put the Transformers very much at the centre of the universe rather than, just Earth or just Earth and Cybertron. We kind of said, look, these are big beings in the whole universe, and there's a whole universe of characters and races that know about them. So I think we just tried to give it that Marvel over-the-top gravitas of those Stan Lee, Kirby comics.
Absolutely, and it feels like that, I mean, one of the things that I always loved about the stuff that you were doing with Transformers, and you mentioned it just there, is that you took it from street level to cosmic level. There was a massive galaxy to play in, and that's very alluring to someone who loves sci-fi. And plus, the concept of these giant robots who have their own culture, it's fascinating. I mean, one of the things I always used to think about was, because they're millions of years old and they've been in a war for millions of years, how do they measure time? How do they measure trauma? Things like that. How does it affect them? So it was fascinating to see things like that sort of, played out. Who's your favourite character to write?
Well, I mean, there's a few. I mean, I've always kind of loved the Grimlock character because, again, we treated him slightly different than either, the animated series or the American comic a little bit. And we just gave him slightly more levels and said, he appears to be one thing, but there's a lot more going on with him.
Yeah.
So he sort of rapidly became a favourite. Galvatron, because he became our character really, and the future cast in particular we felt more invested in those in some way.
For sure.
Because, they were our UK only characters. But, often I've loved the characters that had next to nothing in their sort of bios and tech specs. So you could sort of build the characters without fear of everyone saying, well, that's not how they are, that, that's not the way they work, because they were peripheral characters who we could build into something else, guys like Bludgeon and in Beast Wars there was a character called Razor Beast, and, they were just slightly nothing characters that you could do a lot with.
Well, one of the things that you seem to have is a real eye for the, not just detail, but the vast mythology. I mean, you clearly enjoy the study of all the things, or all the various components and characters involved, and I guess that's why your stories are so satisfying to me, because I'm a bit of a pedant. I like to see all the various things accounted for. Do you think whenever you're writing something like Transformers, it's difficult because there's such a vast array of characters? It's difficult to get them all into to work in a sort of set story in a set way and get everyone to adhere to that mold?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, Bob Budiansky did an amazing job with the character profiles.
Yeah.
The great thing was, they applied the Marvel US storytelling rules to all the setup they did for Transformers. So it was a sort of layered, well thought out concept to start off with. And, Bob gave them so much in the way of character that you're almost spoiled for choice about which ones to use, which ones to focus down on. And, I think you had such great tools there. It was easy just to say, well, I need that character. Well, look, hey, we've got one of those. And just pull them into the mix.
So that's
and I guess I tried to make them, as much as possible, character stories first and foremost, whatever the high concept was, that at heart, all of them were, centric on 2, 3, maybe more characters that you would care about. And, even the villains we tried to make a little more multi-layered and conflicted and not, none of this just straightforward, the Autobots are good, the Decepticons are bad.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of my favourite villains and one of my favourite sort of character pieces was the Dinobots versus Shockwave in that IDW Spotlight. And I just remember thinking, this is just really fantastic. You've got a guy who is, a robot, who is emotionally... he's shut off, he's very clinical. You've got these incredibly sort of brazen Dinobots with a vendetta. They're soldiers, but they're obviously they're breaking protocol to go after this guy. And I thought, this is really interesting, especially your version of Grimlock, where he's not just, mindless almost. He's, a layered character, and it broke away from the TV show in that way. So I love that. I love that, and it's also an interesting fact that there's all these character profiles to draw from, so you can just sort of pick a character and develop them based on, the basics that are already there. Can I ask, have you seen or read any of the incarnations that have basically went after your own with the IDW stuff, like the James Roberts work or the John Barber stuff? And if so, what's your take on it? Do you enjoy it, or?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I've kept pace with the IDW verse. I've enjoyed it as a reader, especially since John and James sort of got hold of the two ongoings, and they brought a lot to it. And James in particular, I just really enjoyed his very different take on the whole thing. Well, it's interesting with the IDW verse because we took the same characters, but we wanted to give them a little IDW spin, so they weren't exactly the same characters. So each of those spotlights and in the series, we tried to say, well, look, here's Shockwave. We know kind of what he is, but how can we put a little spin on that that's different? Here's Grimlock. Let's do him in a slightly different way. And certainly, James and John have followed that through. There was a sort of middle period of the IDW verse where it felt like it was almost like a soft reboot with All Hail Megatron and the first ongoing. But it was just when James and John came back onto it, it was like they just went, right, now we're going to sort of follow through on all the stuff we set up in the Asians and the original Spotlights and Stormbringer. Yeah,
that's exactly what that felt like. I've been getting into them through the IDW collection, the big hardcover collection, and they're a wonderful addition to your bookshelf. One of the things you mentioned as well was James Roberts has a very different take. I think I recall, now correct me if I'm wrong, I could be completely wrong here, I think you'd said in an earlier interview I'd read with you that you always saw the Autobots and Decepticons as sort of androgynous, whereas James Roberts does something quite interesting and quite unexpected for me as a fan, and that is he created relationships between them. He sort of gave them I believe he's responsible for the idea that with the colonies, there's different genders of Cybertronians. So, I mean, what do you think of all that work? It was an interesting direction.
Yeah, absolutely, and they're not my characters, and I've never sort of been resistant to anything like that, because it's different writers, different voices, and different ways to go with it. It's just that I never saw it, especially in the sort of original 80s Marvel incarnation, there was maybe one female character, nominally female character, a few more in the cartoon series.
Yeah, sure.
And it just never seemed a great issue. They were giant robots, really.
Oh, yeah,
and,
sure.
The sort of gender thing never really came into it. And, with the IDW verse, they've just taken that and run with it, and there's, a lot more evidently sort of male-female characters. And that's great, and I think it works really well, and James has made it work really well. I think he's brought it in a way that just, and made it his own in many ways. Yeah. So, I think it just works really now, but, it was never just at the forefront of my interest really in sort of Transformers stories.
For sure, I totally agree. It was something I never would have thought about until it was sort of injected into these stories, but now that it's there, he's done it in such a way as to be so, sort of attuned culturally to the idea of this has always been a thing. It's just not something that's necessarily been at the forefront of the stories, because the majority of the Transformers stories were sort of based during an ongoing war, and on Earth a guerrilla war of sorts, or a sort of Cold War. One of the things that it's been on my mind since IDW have mentioned the reboot, and that is, are you going to be involved? Because I know a lot of people, straight up, myself, I'm one of them. I'm a big fan of your work, and obviously I want to know, are you going to be involved at Ground Zero whenever the universe gets rebooted or relaunched or whatever's going to happen?
No, I'm not involved. I wouldn't rule it out in the future at some time, but at the moment, for a start, I'm sort of very busy on a lot of fronts, and it would be tough to sort of squeeze it in. But I think in a way, I think, probably the way they're going is with a completely different kind of creative team for it, which makes a lot of sense to me, because, I started up the IDW verse, but, part of the change was bringing in E.J. Sue into the mix, because he had a very different style, and it just marked it out as different. And I'm sure that's what they're looking at here, is to just sort of let it start up under new ownership, if you like, in terms of the creatives. And, who knows, down the line, maybe, I'll come back in and do some stuff. But certainly at the moment, there's no involvement.
Well, I, for one, would love to see you get back involved, because, I think there's plenty more stories that I'd love to see told. I'd love to see you involved with. One of the other Transformers franchises that you've been involved with is Transformers Earth Wars the game, and I was interested to know, how far ahead have you plotted for that now?
We run about sort of 2 to 3 months ahead of. We're not madly ahead here, but generally there's a sort of like a couple of months lag between my turning stuff in and the new stories coming into the game, but only because, it gives us lead time to run anything we need to by Hasbro. We recently brought in these completely new Transformers characters into the game. So that required lots of sort of, collaboration with and oversight by Hasbro to make sure we were all on the same page with those characters. So normally it's a couple of months lead time. I know where we're going more or less with the whole of the Prime Corps saga, which is going to run for 2 or 3 more months, and then wrap up. And and then beyond that, we've got plans beyond. So, it's moving nicely.
Fantastic. And I mean, how different is it to write for games than to write for, comic books? Is there any major differences or challenges?
Yeah, it's much more, with comic book writing particularly, it tends to be you largely and then an editor and an artist. But with the game, it's much more collaborative, more people, more input, more sort of, brainstorming in the team, as it were. So, that's the difference from the start. And then literally the writing is kind of strange because there's no real visuals in the sort of saga stuff I'm doing. There's some little heads and movements, but largely it's almost like writing a radio play or something where you don't have, the visuals to support them. So, that's been a challenge as well. And even the mechanical thing of actually writing on more or less a spreadsheet format has been a strange one. But, it's all kind of worked, and I'm very much in the swing of it now.
Is it difficult ceding that level of sort of creative control to, pardon me, to so many different parties? Obviously you're going to have, like you say, whenever you're collaborating on a game, there's going to be a lot of talking heads. So is it difficult giving up, a level of creative control for all the other bodies in the room?
I think it's just a different mindset. I work a lot in TV animation as well.
Oh, sure.
And that's another very team-led thing.
Yes.
And your first draft of any script is not going to be what makes it to the screen. And you have to a little bit let go and trust other people to come in with their opinions, their thoughts, and, produce a product that, everybody's happy with and everybody's behind, right down to the storyboard artists.
Yeah, that's...
So, it's that, and you just have to sort of readjust your mindset. With comics, often what you write, excuse me, is pretty much what ends up on the printed page.
Sure.
But there's various levels in games and animation of letting go of that a little bit and understanding that you're one part of a bigger process and team.
Sure. So I guess you have to take your ego a bit more out of the equation whenever you're working on larger team projects. Yeah.
Absolutely. And often it works to have other opinions in the mix.
Yeah, totally. You'd mentioned that you were involved in TV animation. This was something I was unaware of. What are you actually involved in, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, sure. My first work for animation was on the Beast Wars, the Transformers Beast Wars show. And then I worked on a few series like X-Men Evolution and Alien Racers, Roswell Conspiracies, Dan Dare. There was a CGI Dan Dare series. Okay. So I've worked on quite a few, and then more recently I've been working on a series called The Mad Hatter Chronicles, which is a CITV series.
Right, okay.
Kind of boys action adventure series. And, I'm still working on other projects coming up on that front.
One of the I'll have to keep my eyes out for this stuff because, I sort of hadn't been aware that you were as involved in the TV side, so that's another fascinating tidbit. One of the other franchises that you have been involved in is Doctor Who.
Yep.
You've worked on Doctor Who. I'm just going to bring it up so I can actually have a look and double check because I'd taken notes earlier. No, I can't find it. That was the
Doctor Who. It's never been that much, but back in the Marvel UK days, Doctor Who Monthly originated script material, and I wrote a bunch of stuff for that on the sort of 6th and 7th Doctors.
Yes.
6th and 7th Doctors, and so that was the main bit of Doctor Who stuff I did. And then from there, I've only dabbled, really. I wrote one of the Big Finish audios.
Yes.
And I've written some of the Torchwood stuff. But, although I've done Doctor Who, it's not a vast amount of Doctor Who.
The Axis of Insanity, that's what it was. I'd sort of written it down, but I was trying to find my notes. One of the things about Doctor Who, I have tuned in and out, sort of based on the actors involved. It's something that I do quite enjoy. My favourite Doctor would probably be Tennant, but I've dipped in and out for the Matt Smith, the Peter Capaldi. There was a lot of controversy about Jodie Whittaker, I believe it is. There was a lot of controversy because it was going to be a female Time Lord, and there was a lot of people who were quite up in arms about this. What do you think about a woman taking on the role of the Doctor?
Yeah, I'm completely on board with the idea. It just seems that. It's almost like I'm surprised it didn't happen before this. Maybe they were too worried about the sort of fan reaction to it because, it's a concept that's completely open to that idea. And, even way back when, even though it doesn't turn out to be a female Doctor Who, we ran a little UK strip where the Doctor apparently has regenerated into a woman. And because why not? Why shouldn't it be?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's one of those things where I will be a stickler about established characters like, say, James Bond. My idea of Bond is always going to be Connery. Even though there's been various incarnations, I think, he's always going to be a variation on Connery, But with people who are a bit more amorphous, who, have the ability to change, I have no real issue with it. I'm happy enough for it to happen, and so with Jodie Whittaker taking over as the Doctor, it just wasn't really an issue at all. I was just like, I'm looking forward to seeing how she does, So I hope.
I think people really need to wait and see how she is as the Doctor, whether or not it's male or female. She may not be your favourite Doctor, but it's not necessarily because she's male or female. It's just really you need to see how she fits into the role. And, lots of times I thought, well, that's not my idea of the Doctor. Yeah. And now you can't think of them as other than the Doctor. So, I think people really need to wait and then judge on its own merits.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I guess that it's interesting because I think we live in a time where it's very easy to, instead of go off and, just process what you're thinking about, and go weigh up the pros and cons, it's very easy to go on to the internet and find somebody who's going to agree with you and then get outraged about it. And I see that from all facets of culture. And I think because nerd culture is so niche and has always been, a bit of a haven for... I've talked to a friend of mine about this at length. He runs a radio show called Following the Nerd, and we always have a chat about what it was like to be sort of nerdy and bookish when we were growing up, and you were very much socially ostracized for having these strange interests, whereas now it's very mainstream. And at the time nerd culture was very niche, and I think we've seen this influx of people coming into that culture now, and they're still quite they're quite surprised by how protective and anally retentive the long-term fan base can be.
We had an interesting thing when we did this thing called Regeneration 1 recently, which was a continuation of the original Marvel series.
Oh, sure, okay. Yes, I've got it to read. I'm going to read it soon.
Yeah, and so, that was a strange one because we were picking up something from 21 years before that the kind of fans had grown up with and saying we're going to take it to a conclusion.
Yeah.
And, the internet's both wonderful and terrible.
Yes.
And, midway through, we had feedback from people saying, well, no, that's not the way it should be. And you kind of go, well, it's the way we're writing it. You can't tell us how to do it, but the power of the internet is that people think they can, that they sort of have a stake in it and they can say, well, no, you've done it wrong. And, that's something which is just so weird because it never happened in the past. You would just tell your stories
Yeah.
And kids either like them or not like them, but
Yeah.
they couldn't turn around to the creators and say, that's not right, so it's a weird world, good and bad.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. It's funny because I think the market always decides. I think if people like something and it's popular, then they'll go out and they'll pick up a copy or whatever. And so I think there's a lot of online criticism, but my attitude towards these things is ultimately you gotta look at it and go, well, is it selling? Are the people who are passionate about it interested in it? Are they talking about it? Or are they continuing to keep it afloat? And if that's the case, then you can mark it as a success. So I wouldn't necessarily listen to I have a Twitter account, but I've spoken about this before to various people. Twitter is like the crucible every single day, regardless of whether it's politics, what particular part of pop culture you're into. Twitter is sort of like you go on there and people are becoming recreationally outraged about everything, and they're blowing it up into hysterical, proportions, and so you can't look at what maybe about 100 people making a lot of noise. You have to look at what's the figures behind that, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is like you say, it's a vocal minority often that are the ones who are loudest, which is a strange way, but you do have to sort of grow a very thick skin, and that's something with Transformers. I learned a long while back is that, the fans are great and I love meeting them and, in the end, they, have made my career in just in supporting the comics I've written. But some of them, just, are difficult, and you grow a thick skin with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it's because it's interesting. You said that, said something about, people feel a sense of ownership of something, and I guess that's true. I guess I heard a friend describe it to me once. He used to be into the band REM. Whenever they were an indie band, and he said whenever they became mainstream and started developing a more mainstream style, he almost felt betrayed, like they weren't just his anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same with, nerd culture and comic book culture in general, and definitely Transformers. And that is, now that it's open to this much broader audience, the fans, and, I can relate to this completely. It's like it's not just yours anymore, and it's just not just your little thing, and, it's being made for a more broad mass appeal,
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's... Like I say, there's rough and smooth, but generally my experience of the fans, especially when I meet them at conventions, it's always been very, very positive.
Oh, for sure,
so, you do just have to take on board that, you can't please all the people all the time.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I used to work in a comic shop. One of my first ever jobs was working in a comic shop, and I found that, everybody has their own preference for how they want things to go, and especially in modernity, I think we've got a lot more identification of people who are on the spectrum, and for whatever reason, I'm one of them. I should say I'm definitely one of them. But for whatever reason, a lot of people who are sort of lean into the spectrum on maybe slightly more extreme ends seem to gravitate to nerd culture. And so, I've got a level of pedantry that I know is not normal whenever it comes to things. I like things a certain way, but then I have to check myself and go, oh well, I'm a fan and I want my cake and I want to eat it, but also I have to give the creator some leeway to do something interesting here. So, you know what I mean? So, absolutely. Something else I was going to ask you about. You have written for Marvel Comics. You wrote Alpha Flight.
Yep.
And you also wrote the character North Star. Now, North Star, to my mind, correct me if I'm wrong on this, that he was the first openly gay character that Marvel had actually dealt with. What was it like to write that character, and definitely what would have been more unenlightened times in comparison to, nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting, Alpha Flight. I mean, the whole sort of North Star gay thing had blown up just before I took over.
Uh-huh.
And, I didn't feel like making more of an issue of it than it was, and, we had it, we did the North Star miniseries, and it's like, well, okay, then let's deal with this. But Marvel slightly got cold feet and didn't really commit to the way we wanted to go with that miniseries.
Sure.
I almost felt they were worried about, what they'd done and created, and I think nowadays it would all have been fine. But yes, it was one of those. I think they wanted the publicity, but not necessarily they had the confidence just to let us write a proper story about a gay character. But
sure,
so in the end we found that the miniseries was somewhat neutered in terms of what we could actually where we could go with the development of his character. So, when I look back at it, it plays very much like a fairly regular superhero book, rather than, we had more plans and that continually we sort of had to pull back on.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, because one of the things that Marvel are commonly lambasted for in more sort of current times are that they're a lot of their creators are politically divisive in their storytelling. I've seen a lot of sort of online controversy regards this, and I'm not too sure what to think of it, because I think Marvel were ultimately a liberal company. That obviously, if you look back at what they were doing in the 60s and 70s, they leaned left. But I think there's a happy medium between commercial, successful superhero stories and obviously subversive messages that the creators want to put out there. So it's interesting to hear that they sort of wanted to neuter your project because they were afraid of the commercial ramifications. I mean, in modern times, they're definitely a lot more risky about what they're prepared to put into their books,
Yeah, I mean, I think it just depends on the management at the time, and at the time, even though we weren't proposing anything radical, I think they were just nervous of what they started here, and maybe it was just too early to be as out as they wanted to be with that character.
Sure. Do you mind me asking, what was the story that you wanted to tell with the character?
I mean, the story was just, we just wanted to present him without any sort of sensationalism as a gay character in a gay relationship. And, the more recent North Star stories have all done that now, of course. Yeah. And so some of the things we wanted to do then have happened since, but it was just that we kept having to scale back on the more personal relationship side in favour of more superheroic action side, which was a shame in a way, because we did have a chance just to push the boundaries a little bit of what, what a comic book could have been. We still wanted our quota of supervillains and action, but we really wanted to just slow it down a little bit and show North Star as a person, as a gay person, functioning without the sort of, the initial appearance was slightly histrionic in some ways, and we just wanted to do a much more level, it's no big deal about this, but in the end it just got changed more into a standard, sort of superheroes in tights story.
I think, it's the way that you were. You sound like you're catching what I've got here, Simon.
Amazing Skype, isn't it?
Oh man, I'm telling you, there's something going around. But regards North Star, it's interesting because nowadays Marvel Comics, like I say, they've been lambasted for being politically divisive. But I think what you were talking about, doing a story that's quite simple, with no frills in terms of the presentation of the relationships, I think that's definitely where those type of stories, anything that's going to be potentially controversial, I feel that's where they work best, in that they're presented to you in such a way as it's normal. It's not, it's not in such a way as you either, agree with this or conform to this, or you're a bad person, or there's some, there's not some sort of moral arbitration going on. It's not like you're being judged while you read it. And I think maybe whenever I look back I was reading some Marvel comics from the 1980s and 1990s the other day, and they all had a superhero flavour, but you could tell that the writer was telling their own sort of story. There was a level of subversiveness beneath that was, ebbing out. And definitely when you look at British comics in the 80s, 2000 AD, Crisis, they were notorious for it. But nowadays it seems to be that maybe it's just a little bit ham-fisted in the attempts to put the same message across. It's become ham-fisted, and instead of the story being the primary proponent of what drives it, it's now it's sort of a political punditry almost,
Yeah, I'm sure in a way, just it's mostly the skill. The right creators can tell a great story and get over their point in a way that doesn't sort of come across as sledgehammer or just for effect. And so, in less talented hands, it can just look, slightly, done for the sort of I suppose the shock value or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely, Simon. One of the things I've noticed, oh God, I've completely forgot what I was going to say there. Sorry, it went out of my head. I was about to ask. That's what it was. I was about to bring things back. I wanted to bring things back to one of the characters that you created, and certainly I love and would love to see more of. And it just occurred to me that I hadn't asked you about this as the interview had went along. I'd meant to ask you earlier on. Well, when I say interview, it's more of an informal chat, but Death's Head was a character that you created, and he's been massively popular. A friend of mine asked me, how do you feel about third-party companies making the Death's Head figure, and have you ever got one? And did you ever receive one?
No, I mean, I'd never have. I mean, I think it's a strange thing, these third-party toys of, Transformers or Death's Head. How they exist, I'm not sure at all, but it's. I don't suppose I dislike the whole thing. It's just it exists, and I don't really have anything to do with it because I don't want it to detract from the core character. Who's very much who I always feel very paternal about.
Where did Death's Head come from? What was?
Yeah, it was just in a we dropped him into a Transformers story. We needed an alien bounty hunter. And, because it was a Transformer story, we made him an alien robotic bounty hunter.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And pretty quickly, we realised, just from the way Jeff Senior drew him, that he was maybe a character who had legs in his own right.
Yeah.
So, we pretty much just immediately tried to write a story that made him a Marvel character.
Yeah, for sure.
and it just sort of rolled from there. So he went into Transformers, but simultaneously we sort of established his Marvel credentials as well.
Yeah, whenever you write characters for Marvel, presumably it was under the work for hire, so they hold the do they hold the copyright or?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and because I was nearly sure that I'd seen Death's Head pop up on numerous times since, And I wondered how much, is there any consultation with you as to how the character should work? Of any writers? I think it was Kieran Gillen wrote him recently in an Iron Man run, and I saw him again in I think it was Darkhawk. And
Yep.
I always wondered. I was like, I wonder if Simon Furman gets a phone call, or if anyone sends him a DM on Facebook or
It's
Twitter.
funny. I know Kieran well, so
Uh-huh.
when he first put him in Sword, even before Iron
Oh
Man,
yes, okay.
did sort of send me a kind of, do you mind if I use Death's Head? But,
Oh,
of course, he's not my character, and
yeah.
I'm all, more than happy just to see him in print, in comic books,
Uh-huh.
and carrying on as a character. So, of course, I was really happy, and, I knew Kieran would, treat him with respect, because Kieran was a sort of bit of a fan
Yeah,
of
sure.
Death growing up. So, there have been good, bad, and indifferent ones, but, Kieran definitely had the right sort of attitude to the character. And yeah, generally I'm just really pleased to see him in print, however many times people want to drop him in a comic.
So is it more for you? Do you just enjoy it's almost like an homage in a way to see the character come back again and to see someone give a different take on him?
I mean, I kind of assume it's a generation of writers who remember the character from maybe when they were reading comics first,
Uh-huh.
and like the character enough to put him in their comics. And that's always kind of flattering if that's the case. So generally I'm always really, really happy about that. Even Walt Simonson, who we got to do some Death's Head covers, liked the character and put him in Fantastic Four for one issue. So,
Oh,
we were always really, really pleased when he just got, more coverage in mainstream Marvel.
yeah. I mean, it's nice that you've got that attitude towards it, because it's funny, because I've spoken to other creators who are deathly protective of their characters. So everyone's sort of got a different attitude towards it, I guess. I was talking to Pat Mills recently about his characters, and he was vehemently against the idea that anybody would use them after him unless there was some specific sort of financial compensation. I sort of see both ends of the argument, but I also I understand that while you might love your character and really want them to stay true to your vision of them, it's strange. There's a commercial desire there to have that character continue, and definitely, the fan base in a lot of cases want that character to continue. So I guess the question then becomes, is there a way of doing that? And I think in Pat's case, he wanted. He would obviously want to be financially compensated for the use of Slain or the ABC Warriors or whatever. And what do you think? Do you think it would be a nice thing for creators to be financially compensated whenever they create something for a company? Would it be like a more ethical?
It's difficult. We work in largely a work for hire business, and
Yeah.
every comic is pretty much the same unless you have some kind of creator ownership in those characters.
Yeah.
So, when I hear stories, and I'm really pleased, I know that, say, Kev Hopgood, whenever War Machine appears in the Marvel movies, he and Len Kaminsky, who created the characters, get, sort of a financial nod in that, of creator ownership, not creator ownership, but creators.
Yeah.
They came up with the character. So I think it's really nice, but I don't think it's, I think you would lose a lot of sleep worrying about it and getting angry about it, because largely we are work for hire creators unless, you very much created your own thing, like, Jeff and I have done with To the Death, or other characters have done with their own creator-owned series. But, these characters are either Marvel characters or DC characters or, Fleetway Rebellion characters. And, it's very difficult to claim ownership rights or even financial rights in those characters, nice though it would be.
Yeah, for sure. So, To the Death, you mentioned it just there. It's a creator-owned series. yourself and Jeff, you're putting it out with Comic Scene UK in their annual as a hardback, but as a sort of soft cover. But up till this point, it's been a it's been a digital series. What is the motivation for To the Death Forged by Fire, I believe it is? What made you decide to do something creator-owned and take it out yourself?
Well, I mean, largely To the Death came out of myself and Jeff Senior just wanting to do something kind of new, but that just drew on our past together as well. We did a series for Marvel called Dragon's Claws, and we wanted to take that vibe of sort of future sci-fi war, one man against the system, and kind of put it into something that was ours, that we owned, and all of that spirit, I guess, and turned it into To the Death. And in sheer practical terms of getting it out, we wanted to sort of publish it on the web first, largely because it allowed Jeff the freedom just to draw as many panels as he wanted, really, and just let the series flow out as much as it took to fit, really. So we did a very loose kind of almost screenplay-like approach to the script, and Jeff just drew as many full widescreen frames as he wanted. So, it had a nice sort of organic, filling the sort of requisite amount of space. Jeff could experiment with, more manga-style storytelling in terms of the breaking the action down. And, it was a great thing to do and a massive undertaking. But now, very much, we want to sort of get it into print, because I think a lot of our fans and readers in general would still rather have something tangible, print and paper. So, the first thing we're doing is bringing this little prequel story, Forged by Fire, that we prepared but never used, putting that into the Comic Scene Annual, and then we're in the process of reformatting the digital strip into a sort of maxi series for next year.
Fantastic, mate. Well, personally, I'm really looking forward to it for two reasons. One, pardon me, there's the old tickly cough again. One, because I enjoy writing, but two, because I really enjoy hardback stuff. I did give digital a try. I tried to whittle down my collection, which was a massive amount of long boxes. But what I actually found was that the more I tried, the more I found stuff that I just didn't want to get rid of. And I find that, the act of physically reading stuff, especially a nice hardback, you just can't replicate it through tablet. Obviously, that's just me and it's personal choice. But, one thing I found, and I don't know if you'd be the same, or if you're a little less attached to objects and things, but I definitely find part of the collector mentality in people who read comics is that they have sort of memories attached to items, comics that they've bought, things like that, and so I can't wait for the hardback to come out, because I like the idea that I'm just going to be able to lean over onto my shelf and pick it out. So keep me updated, because I will definitely be looking for a copy.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, obviously we're in the Comic Scene Annual.
Yeah.
We're on Facebook and Twitter as To the Death Comics, so
Brilliant.
People can kind of check in and see where we are with this whole sort of print program that we're setting up now.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, let me see. I think I had some other questions I was going to ask you before we move on. We talked about Death's Head, we talked about Doctor Who and Alpha Flight. The other characters that you've written RoboCop and Terminator. You've also written Judge Dredd. It could be argued that RoboCop and Judge Dredd have a lot of correlations. It's almost like RoboCop was very taken from the Dredd mold. Do you have any interest in ever revisiting those characters, revisiting Dredd, going back to RoboCop, doing anything else with Terminator, or have you told all the stories that you wanted to?
Maybe never to, never say never, but
Yeah.
I've never done that much Dread stuff. I did a lot for the sort of short-lived Lawman of the Future comic that came out around the time the Stallone movie was around. And, I've done a couple of little bits for 2000 AD, but, largely Dread has got its own stable of excellent writers, and I don't know how much I've got to add to that. So, and I enjoyed doing RoboCop, I enjoyed doing Terminator, but I'm always looking, hopefully, to move on to do different things. So, excuse me, at the moment I'm doing a thing called The Vigilant for Rebellion, which is, a kind of reinvention, revamping of old British superheroes, which plays right into my kind of inner fanboy.
Absolutely. I've got it sitting on my to-read pile. Funny, you worked on it with a friend of mine, Simon Colby. He did art tours. I've been trying to get Simon on the podcast. He and I largely have a relationship where we just argue about stuff on social media. So he's a lovely fella, but he did a real bang-up job on art. It was the book looked fantastic. I haven't read it yet, but I have to say I'm really looking forward to it. It just looks great. Tell me, is The Vigilant a one-off, or is there going to be more, or what's the plan there?
It's a one-off at the moment, but, it's done, I think, well enough that, and Rebellion certainly are invested in this Fleetway archive of characters they've got.
Sure.
And, the loose plan is that they're going to be more one-shots for next year, but that's all sort of to be confirmed and stuff. But certainly everybody at Rebellion, from, the editor Keith Richardson to, the owner Jason Kingsley, they're very behind this reimagination of these classic British heroes. So, I think it's just a matter of not if, but when.
There's definitely a market for the revisiting of the obscure in a way, isn't there? I think, especially if you look at things that have been very successful. Like, obviously I'm going to bring up Alan Moore because he did, some brilliant work with League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, where he brought back these literary characters from over a century ago and, right up to modern day. And he sort of made this really interesting timeline that gelled them all together. And then, of course, there's Kim Newman with his Anno Dracula series, where he's done something similar, albeit with all the vampiric lore and all the characters involved in the various movies. It's so, I mean, there's definitely a market for revisiting, older, sort of more obscure characters that no one's thought about in a while. So, I personally, I think it's a really interesting idea. What was it that sort of attracted you to the project, or did they get in touch with you? What was the process there?
Well, I mean, Keith got in touch with me to see whether I wanted to write it. He really enjoyed sort of Dragon's Claws and Death's Head back in the day, and kind of wanted me involved in this. But it just so happened that this was very much, the characters were coming in an era where I was reading them all as a kid, so all of the characters I had a sort of emotional and memory resonance with anyway, so it wasn't like I just had to go and do a whole pile of research. I knew these characters and was excited to be, involved in this, reimagination of them. So, I didn't take much convincing to sign on the dotted line.
Yeah, for sure. And was it difficult to whittle what is quite a lot of concept on a lot of characters into a very tight package? Was it hard to do that, or are you so sort of experienced at this sort of thing by now that it was second nature?
Yeah, it was a pretty packed story. I mean, we had 8 key characters to introduce in one story and actually tell a story, because rather than being an issue one, it was a one shot. It had to be self-supporting, so a lot had to be fitted into quite a sort of limited amount of pages. But my feeling is that when we do more, those characters will start to develop and breathe with more room and more sort of, less sort of crushed to get everybody into one story.
Yeah.
So I think, that it will sort of find its room and its pace as we go along with it.
So these upcoming one-shots would very much, they would almost be like the Rebellion equivalent of the IDW Spotlights, where you were introduced to a character and you get to know them, I guess. You get to know a little bit about their story and their motivations. So is that how the one-shots would work, or would it be more than one character, maybe a couple?
I still think the one-shots will be a bigger story.
Oh, it's...
with just a little more room to breathe for the characters. My only regret with the first Vigilant is it was so sort of, full on the pace to sort of tell the story. We didn't really have a chance much to take them out of their costumes, to show them in their sort of personal lives, to show the people behind the mask more, which is what I really wanted to get to grips with.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think it will simply be that with more room, with more one-shots, we can take time to actually sort of see the people as well as just the heroes.
So is this about how would you say, sort of more of a superhero direction for Rebellion in general? Are they sort of feeding into that? Well, I guess the current zeitgeist in a way, because superheroes are so popular, and Rebellion to date of sort of very much, if you look at 2000 AD and Dread, they're a lot more sort of subversive sci-fi. It's a lot more European than American. So is with the Vigilant line, would this be sort of a move more towards US type of superheroics, or is that just me projecting?
I think it will always be essentially British. We were keen for it not to read like an American superhero comic, but more like the superhero equivalent of 2000 AD. So we came in with that same British, edgy, slightly subversive sensibility.
Sure.
But, as far as Rebellion are concerned, I think it's just that they want to diversify. They've got the sort of Dread universe, the sci-fi line, but they've got this rich archive of superhero characters and robot characters and monster characters that I think they just want to go their own unique way with and not be tied to the 2000 AD tag so much. I don't think it's meant to be 2000 AD presents. It's more, this is the Rebellion verse of superheroes, and it's going to be its own sort of world apart from 2000 AD.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's quite interesting, and I am definitely on board with it. I'm keen to see what you guys do next. One of the other things I was going to ask you is Simon, are there any characters that you've never written that you would really love to write, and you just haven't got a chance to yet? Is there anyone that you've got a real burning passion to write?
Yeah, I mean, there's, I'm a Marvel fan. I love the characters. I grew up reading them. And, I always loved Spider-Man. Mm-hmm. And, apart from a couple of what-ifs and a guest shot in Alpha Flight, I've never really had a chance to get to grips with that character. Yeah. So that would be high on my bucket list. And Iron Man, too, who, again, I've guest starred and what-ifed, but haven't really ever sort of written the main comic in any degree. So, I suppose they'd be top of my sort of characters I've never written but would love to write.
Was there anything specifically about the Marvel characters that, made you fall in love with them, as opposed to, say, the more iconic DC type heroes like Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman?
I think, apart from Batman maybe, the sort of the heroes in the Marvel universe always felt very much more relatable, sort of more grounded in the quote-unquote real world. You know, I always found the DC stories, certainly of previous eras, a little more sort of, you know, fantastical or light or not quite rooted in the real world. And I think I really responded to the likes of Spider-Man and Iron Man and Tony Stark and these very flawed characters behind the mask.
Yeah, Marvel work off that adage, don't they? It's the world outside your window, and they sort of they like to present. I think what made Fantastic Four, there's these really wonderful stories about Stan Lee was ready to quit when his wife June told him to give the Fantastic Four a try, which he did. And what he did was he wrote these incredibly relatable, flawed heroes, and it just turned out that that's what the public wanted. You know, they wanted heroes that they could relate to, and that's where that whole style comes from. That style of flawed superhero. You know, Spider-Man, his whole mythos is built from that bad decision he made, letting his uncle, letting a robber escape, and his uncle would subsequently be killed. You know, so it's interesting because all those guys, they all have these real life problems, and I guess that's what I like about Marvel Comics as well. Is there any Transformers story that you feel that you haven't told that you would really like to tell? Something that, you know, is sort of throughout your various runs on Transformers, you've never had a shot at, but it's something that you personally would really love to do? Or do you feel like you've told all those stories already?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say I've told all those stories, but I do feel that between Marvel and Dreamwave and IDW, I've had, you know, a lot of free run to tell exactly the stories I wanted to tell. With Marvel, I was let to tell these sort of big cosmic gods and monsters stories. With Dreamwave, I got to tell the Cybertron side of the story, the Civil War. With IDW, I got to tell this sort of ground-up conspiracy theory-led approach to it. So, you know, I feel very privileged that I've had lots of freedom, really, just to tell the stories I want to tell. And, you know, I hope there's more in the future, but I can't say I'm missing or feeling I've missed out on anything particularly.
Yeah, so you feel fairly fulfilled in your creative output over the years. I mean, that's great. I guess what I was trying to squeeze you for is was there any sort of had there ever been a story that you'd wanted to tell? And well, with the exception of we'd already talked about Alpha Flight with North Star, and you didn't really get to tell the story that you wanted to tell with him. I was sort of curious, had there ever been a time in, you know, Transformers that, you know, you had a specific vision for something and it didn't get to play out as you would have liked, and, you know, you'd like to revisit that?
No, you know, I mean, generally, I feel pretty, you know, we got to do Regeneration 1, which got to tie up the original series. You know, I wish with the latter parts of my involvement in the IDW verse, we hadn't had to sort of compress everything quite so much to make way for All Hail Megatron. Yeah. But we still got to tell the story. And, you know, other writers have come in afterwards, like James and John, and finished off those concepts. Yeah. So, you know, no, there's very little, I feel, that was never done that I wanted to do. And, you know, really, I can number on one hand stories that, you know, never made it just because of other reasons, you know. So generally, no, all the stories I feel that I wanted out there have ended up out there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I guess, yeah, that's as good an answer as you can get, really. It's great that you've actually had that level of freedom, and, you know, it truly does sound like a lot of creative fulfillment there. You've got to do a lot of what you wanted. So tell me, in brief, where can we find you in the future, Simon? What, with the exception of we've already talked about your upcoming miniseries To the Death, Forged by Fire. What else can we expect in the future from Simon Furman?
Well, hopefully, definitely more Vigilant. I hope that getting To the Death out there, To the Death's a complete story ultimately. So,
Okay.
If that's a success, maybe we can spin off from our own little universe.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm writing Robotech for Titan, which is very
great.
enjoyable, and
Great.
we're pushing that old sort of, 80s franchise into quite new directions and hopefully mix up for the fans of that and giving them something new.
Okay.
And, the definitive collection is pretty much encompassing the whole of Transformers so far, which is great. So, those things, and Earth Wars, I will just push ahead with. And like I say, it's hopefully to be doing more of my own stuff, whether it's The Death or other creator-owned projects in the future.
Just briefly, I wasn't aware that you were doing Robotech for Titan. I will definitely check that out. Are you many issues in, or have you just started?
Yeah, I mean, we're up to issue 12 at the moment, I think. Issue 13 comes out soon.
Okay.
And Brian Wood did the first 4 issues.
Right, okay,
And
okay.
I came in with the second arc and worked with Brian on that one, and then took over completely from issue 9.
Great.
So, yeah, we're rolling with that, and, it's getting really good reaction from Robotech fans, because even though we're following roughly the course of the original series, we're diverging in all sorts of new ways. So yeah, that's been a lot of fun, and I mean, there's a couple of trade paperbacks out already of the series, and more to come.
Well, I will have to get my hands on one. And very briefly, who would win in a fight? One of the Robotech mechs or Megatron?
Megatron. Megatron.
Yeah, I thought so.
The Robotechs are always getting destroyed in the series.
Oh yeah. And plus Megatron's he's just an unstoppable badass.
Yeah, exactly.
I love him so much. Anyway, listen, Simon, it's been an absolute pleasure. This has really been a pleasure to have you on, even though we're both sort of dying of various cold-related...
losing our voices here.
Yeah. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. And listen, mate, I hope we'll get a chance to do this again in the future, because maybe when some more of your future stuff comes out, we'll come on again and have another chat, because ultimately I've had a great time, and I hope you have too. And
it's been great speaking with you, sort of really enjoyed chatting.
Well, it has. It's been an absolute pleasure. Well, listen, guys, this has been, as you all know, this has been Considering Comic Books. I've been Mark McCann. This has been...
Simon Furman.
Yeah, Simon Furman, there you go. And as always, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Take care, and until next time. Thanks for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. You can follow me over at consider_comics on Twitter. That's consider_comics. And you can also check out some of my own work for publications such as 2000 AD, Comic House. And you can also check out stuff I've done with my friend and collaborator Ryan Brown over at ryanbrownart.com. That's where our own little creator-owned project called Esther the Relic can be found for free, so you can just read it for free. And I hope you enjoy it, and as always, I'd love to hear from you. All the best, guys.